The invoice arrived without warning, resting on the doorstep like an accusation wrapped in paper. It did not come with conversation, concern, or context, only an assumption that someone else's emotions could be converted into a debt and passed along as responsibility. Holding it in my hands, I felt a strange calm settle in, the kind that appears when something finally makes sense after years of confusion. This was not about money. It never had been. It was about control, entitlement, and the refusal to accept that another person's life choices do not exist to repair someone else's wounds. Seeing my name typed neatly beside a demand for payment felt surreal. The total was precise, calculated, and unapologetic, as if pain could be itemized and charged to the nearest dollar. The explanation attached to it crossed a line I had spent years trying not to see. It claimed that my happiness had caused harm, that my marriage had created emotional damage severe enough to require professional intervention, and that I was somehow obligated to compensate for it. In that moment, the weight of every boundary I had allowed to be ignored pressed down on me at once. I realized how familiar this pattern was. Whenever something in my life moved forward, it was reframed as an offense. Achievements became provocations. Stability became arrogance. Peace became cruelty. The invoice was only the latest version of an old message. My existence was acceptable only as long as it did not disrupt someone else's narrative. What made this moment different was not the audacity of the demand, but my reaction to it. For the first time, I did not feel guilt. I felt clarity. The demand stripped away any remaining doubt I had carried about whether I was imagining the imbalance. There it was in writing, unmistakable and extreme. It confirmed that there were no limits to what could be asked of me as long as I kept agreeing to carry responsibility that was never mine. The envelope did not ask for understanding or dialogue. It assumed compliance, and in doing so, it revealed how little my boundaries had ever been respected. I thought about all the times I had stayed quiet to avoid conflict, all the moments I had minimized my own discomfort to preserve fragile peace. That silence had not softened anything. It had only taught the other side that escalation worked. The invoice was proof that appeasement does not lead to resolution. It leads to entitlement. The more space I surrendered, the more was taken. What hurt most was not the accusation itself, but the expectation behind it. The belief that my role was to absorb consequences for choices I did not make. The belief that another adult's inability to cope with disappointment could be redirected toward me as a bill. That assumption required years of conditioning to exist, years in which my needs was secondary and my boundaries negotiable. Responding to the invoice took seconds, but arriving at that response took a lifetime. The words were brief because they needed to be. There was no explanation, no justification, no emotional labor offered, just a refusal to participate in the fantasy that I owed something for living my life. Hitting send felt less like defiance and more like release. The backlash came quickly, exactly as expected. Outrage, accusations, warnings disguised as concern. Yet none of it shook me the way it once would have. The invoice had already done its work. It had clarified the stakes. It showed me that any future peace would require distance, not discussion, boundaries, not negotiation. That piece of paper became a turning point because it removed the last excuse I had for staying entangled. It was no longer possible to pretend that reason or patience would eventually fix things. When someone believes your joy is a crime and your independence is a debt, the relationship is no longer mutual. It is extractive. The invoice crossed every boundary because it treated my autonomy as damage and my happiness as liability. It demanded payment not in money, but in submission. Refusing it was not an act of cruelty. It was an act of self-respect. In that moment, I understood that protecting my peace was not something I needed permission to do. It was something I should have done long ago. That envelope did not break me. It freed me. It showed me exactly where the line was and gave me the courage to finally stop letting it be erased. A lifetime of favoritism does not announce itself loudly. It settles in quietly, shaping expectations and emotions long before anyone learns the words to describe it. Growing up under its influence teaches you how to observe rather than speak, how to sense shifts in mood before they are expressed, and how to make yourself smaller so that someone else can remain comfortable. It becomes normal to accept unequal treatment as simply the way things are, even when it leaves behind an ache that never fully fades. Silence often becomes a survival skill in environments where one voice consistently matters more than another. When praise flows freely toward one person, the absence of it toward someone else becomes its own kind of message. You learn that speaking up risks being labeled difficult, ungrateful, or dramatic, so you begin to internalize disappointment instead. Over time, that silence hardens into habit. You stop expecting fairness, and eventually you stop asking for it, convincing yourself that endurance is the same as strength. Favoritism rarely appears as cruelty. More often, it disguises itself as concern, protection, or justification. One person's mistakes are explained away, while another's are quietly remembered. One person is excused for emotional outbursts, while another is praised for staying calm. The imbalance is subtle enough that outsiders may never notice it, yet powerful enough to shape an entire family dynamic. Those who benefit from it often remain unaware, while those affected learn to adapt in ways that cost them parts of their identity. Unspoken resentment grows in the space where acknowledgement should have existed. It is built from moments that seem small on their own, but heavy when added together. The times your achievements were met with indifference. The moments your feelings were brushed aside to protect someone else's comfort. The repeated lessons that harmony mattered more than honesty. Resentment does not appear suddenly. It accumulates quietly, fed by years of swallowing words that deserve to be spoken. In such environments, comparison becomes unavoidable. You learn early how success is measured differently depending on who achieves it. One person's ambition is celebrated, while another's is treated as inconvenient. This creates a confusing internal conflict where pride and shame coexist. You are proud of what you accomplish, yet hesitant to share it. You want to be seen, yet fear the consequences of visibility. That tension follows you into adulthood, influencing how you approach relationships, confidence, and self-worth. The most damaging aspect of favoritism is how it distorts responsibility. Those who are favored may never learn accountability because consequences are softened or redirected. Those who are overlooked often learn to overcompensate, believing they must earn validation through patience and self-sacrifice. Over time, this imbalance creates emotional distance that feels impossible to bridge. Attempts to address it are often dismissed as overreactions, reinforcing the silence that allowed the problem to grow in the first place. Unspoken resentment does not always manifest as anger. Sometimes it appears as emotional withdrawal, exhaustion, or a quiet sense of resignation. You continue to show up, fulfill expectations, and maintain appearances, all while carrying the weight of unmet needs. The resentment remains unnamed because naming it would disrupt the fragile peace everyone depends on. Yet the cost of that peace is borne unevenly, falling on the person who learned earliest how to disappear. As years pass, the patterns become clearer. You begin to recognize that the dynamic was never about merit or effort, but about roles that were assigned and reinforced over time. One person was allowed to take up space freely, while another was expected to accommodate. Understanding this can be painful, but it also brings clarity. It explains why certain wounds never healed and why certain relationships always felt unbalanced no matter how much effort you invested. Breaking away from a lifetime of favoritism and silence requires acknowledging what was lost, not to assign blame, but to reclaim truth. It means allowing yourself to feel the resentment you were taught to suppress and recognizing it as a signal rather than a failure. The silence that once protected you may no longer serve you, and learning to speak can feel unfamiliar and risky. Yet within that risk lies the possibility of healing. A lifetime shaped by favoritism leaves marks that do not disappear easily, but awareness transforms them. When silence gives way to understanding, resentment no longer controls the narrative. Instead, it becomes a reminder of how deeply you deserve to be seen, heard, and valued all along. When my wedding became her breaking point, it did not happen in a single dramatic moment. It unfolded through subtle shifts in behavior, strained smiles, and a tension that clung to every interaction long before the ceremony arrived. What should have been a celebration of love slowly transformed into a mirror, reflecting everything she felt she had lost. My happiness, which I had hoped would be shared, became something she measured herself against. And in that comparison, something inside her began to unravel. At first, her reaction appeared supportive on the surface. She asked questions, offered opinions, and spoke as if she were invested in the process. Yet beneath her involvement was a sharp edge, a need to control details that were never hers to decide. Each suggestion carried an undertone of correction, as though my choices required her approval to be valid. When I declined to reshape the day around her preferences, her demeanor shifted in ways that were impossible to ignore. What I viewed as personal decisions, she interpreted as rejection. As the planning continued, it became clear that the wedding symbolized more than a milestone. To her, it represented a verdict. Every confirmation of dates, venues, and guest lists reinforced the reality she was desperate to avoid. I was moving forward while she felt suspended in place, and that contrast intensified her internal conflict. She did not express this directly. Instead, it surfaced through criticism, passive remarks, and an insistence on being centered in moments that were not meant for her. The closer the wedding came, the more fragile her composure became. Small inconveniences triggered disproportionate reactions, and neutral boundaries were treated as personal offenses. It was as though the existence of the ceremony challenged her sense of worth. Rather than confronting her own pain, she redirected it outward, framing herself as overlooked and misunderstood. My attempts to maintain peace only deepened the pattern, as compromise was never enough to satisfy the need she could not name. On the day itself, the emotional strain reached a point she could no longer contain. The atmosphere was filled with warmth and anticipation, yet her presence carried a tension that disrupted the balance. I noticed it in her posture, in the way she watched the room rather than the moment. While I focused on the commitment I was about to make, she appeared consumed by the attention she felt was slipping away. The ceremony became the stage where everything she had suppressed finally demanded to be seen. When she interrupted, the shock rippled through the room. What should have been a sacred exchange was fractured by her need to assert herself. The words she spoke were less important than the message behind them. She was not reacting to a specific slight. She was reacting to years of unresolved disappointment. In that moment, my wedding ceased to be about love and unity and became, in her mind, evidence of her own failure. The interruption left behind a silence heavier than any confrontation. As the ceremony resumed, I felt a mixture of sorrow and clarity. Sorrow for the relationship I had hoped we could share, and clarity in understanding that her pain was never truly about me. It was about expectations she carried, comparisons she nurtured, and a self-image that could not survive someone else's joy. Her breaking point revealed the depth of a struggle she had refused to confront. After the ceremony, the absence she left was just as loud as her disruption. Conversations avoided her name, and laughter carried an undercurrent of discomfort. I smiled, greeted guests, and fulfilled the rituals of the day. Yet part of me grieved quietly, not for the moment she disrupted, but for the realization that my happiness could never exist neutrally in her presence. It would always be filtered through her unresolved pain. In the days that followed, the weight of what had happened settled in. The wedding had not broken her. It had exposed what was already fractured. It forced into the open a truth I had long resisted. My milestones would continue to trigger her unless she chose to face what she was running from. Understanding this shifted something within me. I stopped asking why my joy felt threatening to her and started accepting that her breaking point was never mine to manage. When my wedding became her breaking point, it marked the moment I finally saw the limits of what empathy could repair. It taught me that love does not require sacrificing milestones to protect someone else's comfort. Some celebrations reveal not only what we gain, but also what we must let go of in order to move forward. Calling out the pattern no one wanted to see felt less like an act of confrontation and more like stepping into uncomfortable light after years of living in shadow. The pattern had always existed, quietly reinforced by avoidance and softened by excuses, but naming it threatened the fragile balance everyone relied on. For a long time, it seemed easier to stay silent than to challenge something so deeply woven into family dynamics. Silence kept gatherings peaceful, conversations polite, and roles unquestioned, yet it also allowed the same cycle to repeat. Unchecked and unexamined, the pattern revealed itself through repetition rather than singular events. Each conflict followed the same script: an emotional reaction framed as injury, responsibility shifted outward, and immediate reassurance provided without question. Accountability never entered the conversation. Instead, sympathy replaced reflection, and the focus shifted to restoring comfort rather than understanding cause. Those who benefited from this arrangement saw no reason to question it, while those harmed by it learned that raising concerns only invited more tension. For years, I doubted my own perceptions. When everyone around you avoids naming what feels obvious, self-doubt becomes a constant companion. I questioned whether I was being unfair, overly sensitive, or unwilling to forgive. That uncertainty was part of what kept the pattern alive. As long as I remained unsure, the cycle could continue without resistance. The discomfort I felt was easier to internalize than the conflict that would arise from speaking out. The moment I finally spoke, the reaction confirmed how deeply the pattern was protected. What I described was not new information, yet it was treated as a betrayal. The discomfort in the room was immediate, not because the observation was false, but because it disrupted a long-standing agreement to look away. People shifted in their seats, avoided eye contact, and attempted to soften my words with reinterpretations that preserved the status quo. The goal was not clarity, but containment. Calling out the pattern did not come with raised voices or accusations. It came with calm words spoken at a moment when silence would have been easier. That calmness unsettled people more than anger ever could. Anger could be dismissed as emotional. Clarity could not. The pattern, once named, lost its invisibility. Even those who resisted acknowledging it could not fully unhear what had been said. What became clear in that moment was how much energy had been spent maintaining the illusion that nothing was wrong. Years of smoothing over incidents, reframing behavior, and prioritizing immediate peace had created an environment where harm was normalized. By naming the pattern, I was not introducing conflict. I was exposing it. The resistance I encountered was proof that the pattern served a purpose for those invested in keeping it intact. The aftermath was uncomfortable and revealing. Some people responded with defensiveness, insisting that intentions mattered more than impact. Others tried to redirect the conversation toward reconciliation without addressing the behavior itself. A few remained silent, their expressions reflecting recognition they were not ready to voice. The varied reactions highlighted the difference between those willing to examine the truth and those determined to preserve familiarity. No matter the cost, calling out the pattern did not immediately change behavior, but it changed awareness. The dynamic could no longer operate entirely in the background. Each repeated action now carried context, making it harder to dismiss as isolated or accidental. The pattern's predictability became undeniable. Once seen clearly, it lost much of its power. What had once felt overwhelming now appeared as a series of choices rather than an unavoidable reality. The most significant shift occurred within me. Speaking the truth removed the burden of carrying it alone. I no longer felt responsible for protecting others from discomfort that originated from their own avoidance. The fear that had kept me quiet for so long dissolved into a sense of grounding. I understood that being honest did not make me unkind. It made me aligned with myself. Calling out the pattern no one wanted to see was not about forcing change or demanding validation. It was about reclaiming my own clarity, whether others accepted that clarity was beyond my control. What mattered was that I no longer participated in the pretense. Naming the pattern marked the end of my silence and the beginning of a boundary that allowed truth to exist, even when it made others uncomfortable. Choosing no contact was not a sudden decision driven by anger or spite. It arrived quietly, built from years of emotional exhaustion and the growing awareness that peace could not exist alongside constant turmoil. The chaos had become so familiar that it once felt unavoidable, as if living on edge was simply the price of maintaining connection. Yet over time, the cost grew too high, and the realization emerged that distance was not abandonment but preservation. For years, I believed endurance was proof of love. I stayed available, answered messages, and showed up to conversations that left me drained and unsettled. Each attempt to maintain connection required me to absorb tension that was never mine to carry. The cycle repeated endlessly: conflict, temporary calm, and renewed disruption. I told myself that patience would eventually lead to understanding. But patience alone cannot repair a dynamic that thrives on imbalance. The decision to step away came with grief I did not anticipate. Letting go of contact meant releasing not only the person, but also the hope that things might someday be different. That hope had sustained me longer than it should have, convincing me that proximity was necessary for healing. Accepting that it was not required meant confronting the truth that some relationships do not evolve, no matter how much effort is invested. No contact created a silence that initially felt unsettling. Without constant messages or emotional demands, I had space to notice how much tension had defined my daily life. The absence of chaos revealed how deeply it had shaped my reactions. I realized how often I anticipated conflict, braced for criticism, or adjusted my behavior to prevent outbursts that were never within my control. Distance allowed my nervous system to rest for the first time in years. Peace did not arrive as a dramatic transformation. It unfolded gradually, through ordinary moments that no longer carried anxiety. Mornings felt lighter without the weight of unresolved conflict lingering in the background. Conversations became simpler, free from the need to explain or defend myself. I discovered that calm could exist without justification, and that I did not need permission to protect my emotional well-being. Choosing a life without chaos required redefining loyalty. I learned that loyalty does not mean sacrificing stability to maintain familiarity. True loyalty includes respect for boundaries and accountability for actions. When those elements are absent, distance becomes a form of honesty rather than rejection. I stopped viewing no contact as a punishment and began understanding it as a necessary boundary that allowed healing to take root. The reactions to my decision varied. Some questioned my choice, interpreting it as avoidance or coldness. Others quietly expressed understanding, admitting they too had struggled within the same dynamic. I listened without defending myself, knowing that my peace did not require universal approval. The clarity I gained through distance made it easier to release the need to be understood by everyone. Over time, the absence of chaos reshaped my sense of self. I became more present, more confident in my choices, and less reactive to external pressure. I began investing energy into relationships that offered mutual respect and emotional safety. Without constant turbulence, I could finally hear my own thoughts clearly and make decisions rooted in intention rather than fear. Choosing no contact did not erase the past, but it changed my relationship with it. The memories remained, yet they no longer dictated my present. I understood that healing does not always involve reconciliation. Sometimes it involves acceptance of what cannot be changed and the courage to step away from what causes harm. A life without chaos is not empty. It is spacious. It allows room for growth, connection, and self-respect. By choosing no contact, I chose peace over familiarity and stability over obligation. That choice continues to shape my days in quiet, meaningful ways, reminding me that protecting my well-being is not selfish. It is the foundation upon which a healthier life is built.